Welcome back, guys, to the Beyond Condition podcast, the voice of bodybuilding. I am your host, Sarah Parker, and today we are here for a solo episode, a conversation I had. And I must admit, this conversation in itself blew my mind. And I'm very open to different perspectives always because for sure it helps me grow as a human being. But when it comes to the bodybuilding space, of course, gaining different insights into what we come across in the bodybuilding world is super important as a coach, as your podcast host, and for me as a bodybuilder in itself. Because we can always reflect, we can always understand more into our own behaviors and thought processes. And if you listen to the podcast, you'll know parts of my story and how I've essentially, I guess, called myself out, had other people call me out, and I go deep, I go in, and I try and understand more and more about the way I do things. And we know in this space there is a lot of food relationship questions, thought processes, behaviors, how we should and shouldn't do things. And what I would say is when we look at bodybuilding and what we do in regards to food, for sure, it's thrown around that it's disordered, it's controlling, it can bring out OCD type behaviors, it can bring out neuroticism, and we all have our own journey here. I'm sure there's people listening that don't really find it, a problem as it were to just track their food, do what they need to do as a bodybuilder. I do believe the more and more you get into bodybuilding, the more and more this becomes very, very normal. You track your food, you eat your food at a certain time, you have meal one, meal two, meal three, and so on. And it replaces the normal breakfast, lunch, and dinner. That's sort of, I guess, one of the things we have as our identity. We label things differently to the outside world. And I actually like that. I like that, whenever I frame and label what I'm doing, it's like, as I say, meal one is X at X time. And, it forms the different way to look at things. And I feel like that attracts many people to bodybuilding because we are different. We absolutely are. And I love it. The weird and wonderful ones of us that pursue this endeavor. And I feel like when you're able to, and I often say get off on it, right? And be different. It adds to your substance and who you are. And when we find bodybuilding, it can often become our thing. We pursue the endeavor and we find so much, but we can also find things that do debilitate us that can become detrimental to our own mental health. And that is a thing. And there's a lot that comes into the identity of a bodybuilder. And I really do believe that for all of us, the more and more self aware we can become of what we do, the more and more we can gain from bodybuilding in itself. Now, when it comes to the food and the conversation I had, it was actually with a coach that I know very, very well. We've known each other for years, and I actually spoke with him at a show and we were talking about a variety of different things. And as I say, this blew my mind, this perspective, because it was a different way to think about it. So he actually said that binging is a cry for help as a bodybuilder. And I was like, whoa, okay, I haven't sort of thought of it like that before. But absolutely, straight away, it was like, okay, that does make sense. And what he said was that when you binge as a bodybuilder, that it's so far away from your normal and what you're quote unquote meant to do that it's a way of going, I need help, I need support, I'm losing control, I'm not in a good space mentally. And he likened it to if this was outside of bodybuilding, someone's cry for help could be, an attempt on their life, saying certain things that show that mentally they require help, support, guidance. And it was like, whoa, you know, the power in that. Because when we look at binging, when we look at even overeating, and there is a difference, but they verge in the same path, it is for sure something that can happen very commonly in this space. And I would say that it's, a lot of people think it's post show. A lot of people would label that the binging type behaviors are post show. However, in my experience as a coach and with speaking with a multitude of people, it's not just post show. This can happen at any time because really we do have the option to eat what we want when we want. We remove that to a certain degree when we are on this path as a bodybuilder because, as I say, we have our set meals, set times, set quantities, etc. And when we look at if you were to binge or overeat, that can absolutely wrap round into a self-sabotage cycle where you lose control with food. Now, when we look at what we do day to day, we are very much in control of what we're doing. We're ticking boxes, we're doing everything we can in our power to pursue this path. But when we lose control, where does that go? And how does that make you feel? It can really, really hit you mentally when you've essentially come away from your plan or done something that you didn't realize was going to happen. When we look at overeating and binging in itself, a lot of the time it can be something that becomes out of control and it's almost like something takes over and you eat until you're full, or you eat past that and perhaps you make yourself sick, or perhaps you then start to over restrict. You start to try and make back what you've done. And I know in the past when I've faced these times, and particularly for me post show, where I have eaten until I'm full, but where it's been quite quick, I actually reach that point where I feel like I'm feeling sick. My stomach is distended. I don't feel good. And generally speaking, it's because my body hasn't caught up with what I'm doing. The hunger hormones are pretty skewed after a show and after a prep. And suddenly you're overwhelmed with this feeling of what I'd call like a food baby because you haven't eaten that amount of food for quite some time. And suddenly the regret kicks in. And, when I've experienced this, particularly in the earlier days, I wouldn't know what to do. And it wasn't because I was trying to self-sabotage myself. It wasn't because I didn't feel like I was losing control. It was because the food tasted nice. I wouldn't say it was a binge. I would say that I just enjoyed the food. I was with family, friends, and it was like, this tastes so nice. I now have the option for variety. And always with my coach, it would be, go have a meal, enjoy multiple, if you want to have couple of different starters, a main, some desserts, enjoy that time. And it was almost like my eyes were too big for my belly, right? That's a saying that we could utilize. And I would feel terrible when I'd get this dump of, whoa, my gut is overwhelmed here. I am now overwhelmed mentally. I don't know what to do. I feel like I've let myself down. I feel like, why can I keep the discipline that I had in prep? And actually, when I dig down on it, when I work on, my own relationship with food, it's like, yes, I've eaten, a large quantity of food, but does that mean that I've fucked everything? Does that mean I'm a bad person? And I don't believe it does. And I've learned from it. And that's the huge pivotal part here. I've learned from, actually eating slower, not being too obsessed with what I'm going to have after a show, just seeing how I feel, because that definitely changes. Sometimes you have in your mind, I want to eat X, Y, and Z. You get to that point and you're like, actually, I've changed my mind here. I'd prefer to have X, Y, and Z. And I feel like it's super important to continue giving that message as to making memories around this time and having foods that Hopefully, we can opt for things that digest well, that we know we enjoy. Perhaps we can go to a restaurant rather than a fast food place because perhaps it's made with things that are a little bit more friendly on your GI. And that's not to limit what you want to do or what you want to have. In this space for sure, there's bakes, there's fast food, there's things that on the face of it, that sort of palatable thing that you're like, oh my God, I really want X, Y, and Z. And those things for sure can be incorporated. Of course, speaking with your coach and being able to factor those things in is important so your coach knows what's happening. But sometimes, I know that coaches will say, eat what you want post show. Again, that can lead to a bit of overwhelm when everyone's sort of saying, oh, do you want this? Do you want this? And you're thinking, oh, I want this. Suddenly you eat an X amount of things and you get to that point of overwhelm. Now, this is obviously a different thought process and conversation to the conversation I had around this being a cry for help. And it's hard when you are in the bodybuilding space and for whatever reason, you feel like you need help and support and you are looking for essentially a cry for help because it can be a very isolated sport. We're deemed as the most driven of people. We're deemed as the people that are disciplined day in, day out. We can do a prep, we can compete. We are, motivated all the time. We've got our ducks in a line. We know exactly where our route is heading. We know what we want to do. But that's not always the case. We can absolutely become lost on this journey. And that's where you then start to feel quite isolated. And who do you talk to? And this is huge, guys, because reaching out for help and support is not always easy for someone who is a bodybuilder. Because, as I say, we're deemed as these people that are unstoppable. We know exactly what we want. But sometimes, whether that be through the bodybuilding endeavor in itself, whether that be through a prep and post show, whether that be because personal life circumstances come up, maybe it's an injury, maybe it's surgery, all of the things that can essentially stop us where we are, those things that lead to us questioning ourselves, challenging our narrative, causing a challenge or an obstacle, we are still human. And I know I say this on the podcast, but we absolutely are. Because when we are essentially finding comfort in food, that's a very human behavior. Where we track back all those years ago when humanity started, hunter-gatherers, the main ethos around that was to hunt, cook food, eat food, do what we need to do to survive. When we are in a prep, we are just about surviving half the time. We're pushing for a deficit, we're doing a lot of expenditure, we're going against our hormonal state. We're not meant to walk around shredded to the bone. We're not meant to be over exercising, under eating. And this is where we have this label as we're walking food disorders. We've all got issues. And it's not a nice way to say and treat our community. It absolutely is not. Because I meet bodybuilders that, yes, we all have our own little things, but I meet bodybuilders that thrive in this environment. But a lot of the time, like myself, it's meant years of work and self-awareness to how we can be enjoying the bodybuilding for what it is rather than these sort of, disordered ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. And what I will say is that if you need support, if you need help, there's nothing wrong with reaching out to someone, but we have to be able to take ownership of how we feel within ourselves to be able to take that step because we can acknowledge how we feel about a certain scenario, but then bridging that gap to actually reaching out and going, I need help. That's where the difficulty can sometimes hit us because it's like the moment those words leave your mouth that you need help, are you weak? Are you someone that shouldn't be bodybuilding? And this is where I feel like this wraps around into if you do overeat, if you do binge, there could be potential for kickback on you shouldn't be bodybuilding then. And I know from working with food disorder specialists, from speaking with lots of psychologists, that actually, if there is a food disorder, that a lot of the time the promotion to step back from tracking your food would be the right move. But then that means for you as an individual, as a bodybuilder, that means you're losing a huge part of what you do. So where does that leave you if you want to ask for help, but you don't want to stop bodybuilding? And trust me, this is very common in our space. Trust me, it is. Because that scarcity, that fear that bodybuilding is going to be taken away from you because you are struggling with food is real. It is. And what I will say is when we are looking at the food side of things and the relationship with food, yes, you can work on this yourself, very much like I have, but it takes years and it is a hugely uncomfortable, scary time to actually admit that there is some problems there. And that can cover all different ways when you look at food, right? That could be that you actually self-restrict. It doesn't necessarily mean that you overeat. And when you get to this spot and it's like there's something here, I do need help. I believe that there is that option if you can accept that this has got out of control, that you do need the support to essentially work with someone that does have qualifications and they are a professional in the space of helping you with a food disorder where you could work on that separately with them and still train and still adhere to the majority of the tick boxes as a bodybuilder. And this is the thing when we look at it, being able to step back from the tracking of the food, the set meals, and maybe, it becomes more flexible. We're looking at X amount of, protein, being able to incorporate micronutrients, diversifying your palate, being able to eat different foods. We can still look at being able to do the other bodybuilding tasks and still stay on track as a bodybuilder, work on that relationship with food, and then be able to move back into bodybuilding if that is the right path. But as you can already tell, this could take months, years, and that can be a daunting space to be in. It really, really can. And what can happen is if we ignore this, that can just go on for years and years and years. And perhaps actually, mentally, that is so detrimental to you. Do you ever go back to stage? Do you ever really, really benefit fully from the bodybuilding endeavor when it is so mentally crushing for you that you just feel this sense of overwhelm all the time? And what I will say is, when we do look at the different phases, what we can look at is being able to have that off-season period of time to absolutely work on a lot of things before we were to look at going back to stage. And that's certainly what I've done. My my biggest strides forward with working out on my relationship with food, my relationship with my body, my relationship with the whole of bodybuilding really was when I had a longer off season. I'm currently in a mini cup. I did my 19-week diet this year and I literally blew myself away at how well I handled the reverse out from the 19-week diet and how well I'm ebbing and flowing through the phases with really minimal food focus. I just do what I need to do in these phases. Now, that's not saying if I was to push it to stage condition, perhaps things come back up. Perhaps behaviors come back up with my relationship with food. The reason I share my story, guys, is that absolutely, if we look at a 19-week diet, I wasn't, you know, really, really far away from stage lean. Yes, I would need to still diet for X amount of time and there'd be a peak week, etc. And I would like to push condition more from where I achieved after the 19-week diet. But I was just so happy with how I felt when the diet had ended. I didn't have that yearning to eat a load of food. I didn't have that yearning to, go, oh, fuck it at all, at all. And honestly, it was so refreshing. And why I want to share this is to share that it is possible. You know, my story, guys, like I'd like to say that I'm one of and I don't know how many from a statistic standpoint, but my neuroticism, my behaviors around food was wild, like wild beyond words. When I think back, it's very upsetting because I was so neurotic with everything had to be to the fucking letter. I had to eat my meals at the same time. I had to, and the thing is, when I say to the letter, it was beyond that because I'd stick to my macros to the nth degree, but I would be neurotically checking Tupperwares. I'd serve my meal, I'd then put it in the fridge, I'd check it's still there, I'd move it so it's straight. Okay, my meal is there. Shut the fridge door. Open the fridge door again. Is the meal okay? Right? Nothing's happened. The meal is still there. It's still exactly where it needs to be. I would check, I'd weigh my vegetables. I'd check it 5 times. Have I weighed this exact? I would measure everything several times. I'd cook things. I'd check that they were exactly how I wanted them. As an example, say sweet potato. I'd be checking it with a fork. I'd be watching it. I'd be thinking, is it about the right texture? Okay, so that looks okay. If it wasn't when I went to eat it and reheat it out the Tupperware, I'd be really upset, these types of things. And this was a daily thought process. I would visualize my food. I'd food prep for hours and hours and hours when I don't need to. I can easily weigh out my vegetables, cook them, eat them, right? It doesn't need to be like that, but it was for me for so many years and it crippled me. And now to be here, literally after the shoot I did after my 19-week diet, I went and had a Subway salad. Now I know I'm well known for the lettuce, and that's become, a bit of my identity. It's a bit of a joke, but I was just like, I want to have, around peaking for that. It's like, fast release carbs, bit of fats in the morning, a little bit of protein, carb like sweets, jam, etc. to pump up. And I'm like, I just want my protein. So I had like triple chicken, my salad, get some micronutrients in. That's great. I don't feel really, really hungry because often when we start to peak, you start to drive that like, I'm hungry. I'm not really eating anything here. It's fast release carbs. And then if we're left, after we've competed or after we finish a diet, we're left in that interstitial space of I'm so hungry, don't know what to do. And that can lead to the point where we have that overwhelm, we overeat, we binge, etc. So being able to do, and that's what I've learned over time, being able to do things like that, having some good protein, having some micronutrients post diet or post show, and then being able to lead to having a meal. Have a think about it. What do I fancy? Go to a nice restaurant, have a look at the menu, what looks good, and be able to go, okay, so let's have a starter if you want one. Let's have a main. Do I fancy a dessert or not? Okay, let's make a decision when I'm there. And I know that this is not always easy, right? When you're backstage, there's lots of people with different foods. People might have gifted you foods. I always feel like it's super important to, of course, remember food will always be there, but actually think about, okay, so these are the foods I've got. Maybe people have gifted you. Do I actually like them? This is a way I think about it, and this is not to lead to more, psychological duress here, but I often think, are the calories worth it? Is that sweet treat, is that box of chocolates, is that going to give me true fulfillment, or is that going to start to open the chasing of the dragon to eat more of that? And this is why having something like protein, having some micronutrients initially when you finish your diet or prep can just help you to take a moment to actually have something that's going to help satiate you, to have some good nutrition, have some fluids for sure, because we often are quite dehydrated around this time. And then I believe personally, we can lead to more rational decisions because we're not starving, we're not feeling those hunger hormones suddenly lit up and it's like, whoa, what do I do? And then being able to look at the consequence of, does that help me to feel more in control? If it does, then you can potentially work on, if you have overeaten in the past, if you have binged around this time, actually, can I do better here? Can I remain more in control? Can I make more decisions that are efficacious to my mental health? And of course, then the GI, the effect that we can face on our GI. And I definitely would say it gets more and more, I don't want to say easy, but as we experience post shows and post diets, we sort of know what to come. However, if you've had an off season and then you've gone back for a prep, if you've pushed yourself maybe more in this second prep, if you've, dealt with more challenges in this second prep, if you think I'm in control, I'm all good, and then suddenly you get to that point of being in that extreme deficit, and then suddenly you're post show, your hunger hormones are still going to react in the same way. Again, let's think about this. We are human, and that's important as well because we can think I'm fine, but it does take over. We do have emotions. Food tastes nice. Food makes memories. All of these things that I've spoken about today. But definitely, it's an evolution. And what I would say as well, guys, is there is a consideration to who you were before bodybuilding, and that can be missed in this space. Because if you were, you know, when you look at your relationship with food before bodybuilding, if you were someone that has come from being overweight and then you found bodybuilding, you've done preps, etc., there absolutely is, and it's tough. There is the likelihood potentially, and this is something I've picked up from my own coaching, that when we do reverse out, you can find that your fat stores repopulate quicker than if someone was on the leaner side before getting into bodybuilding and before doing a prep. And it may mean, and this is not just if you were overweight, maybe you're a smaller individual, there's lots of different things, genetic components as well. It might be that your calories are going to go up pretty slow over a period of time as you start to regain health, as your body composition changes, as you step away from being lean. And that can sometimes lead to you feeling almost, and I'll just say it how it is, you can sort of feel a bit hard done by, right? You can see other people in the realm getting food bumps, their calories are quite high, they're 4 weeks post show, and it's like, oh, my calories are still quite low in your own mind, right? But that is part of the bodybuilding journey. And as I say, that's not easy to sometimes handle. In my first good few off seasons, my calories didn't go above 2000. And that was at the tail end of a whole off season. And I often say this to clients, I'm hungry all the time. I'm hungry in off season. But what I will say is over doing multiple seasons, and this is very, very true if you have come from a background of being more overweight, also that actually your ability to, as you gain more muscle, as you do more preps, your ability to push calories up higher may well increase because in my own example, I've obviously gone assisted. I was natural for multiple years and multiple seasons, and then going down the assisted realm, I absolutely can tolerate more calories in an off season. I can bring my calories up higher. I have more muscle that facilitates me being able to eat more in an off season, and the journey goes on. But I almost feel like, and this is how I say it to myself, I've sort of almost earned the right, as it were, right? Like if you told me back when I started that in an off season I could get to nearly 4,000 calories, I'd be like, no way, that's fucking cool. And that's reality now, but that's 13 years of doing the do. And yes, it's quite hard to sometimes relate to that if you're right here, right now in your first off season or reverse out and you feel like your calories are quite low. But then that comes to we're looking at a physique based sport, we're looking at a physique based endeavor. And this is where, when we commit to the competitive bodybuilding side, we then have a commitment to what needs to happen. And again, I'm not saying that's easy in any way, shape, or form, but if your calories need to go up slower to maintain a good level of body composition, to keep it more favorable as you move through an off season, it's all for the bigger picture. If you start at a prep and your body composition is, not at a point where it's not going to be a quick prep, it's going to be a longer prep. If you've pushed up a considerable amount, the prep is going to be potentially longer, harder, and it's trying to work out what that looks like for you. And of course, working with your coach to plot that out and timeline it. Some people, and I've done it, and I've said this before, I believe, a lot of people can absolutely push up in, and the best way to frame this is when I've pushed up more so in an off season, that's been where I've found that I've had a really good amount of muscle gain. And then going into a prep, my physique has progressed more than previous off seasons when I haven't pushed up as much. However, that doesn't mean that you necessarily need to do that every time. I feel like a lot of competitors I've spoken to have done that potentially once in their whole bodybuilding career where they found that they've taken longer, pushed up that little bit more, and yielded the results as they've moved forward through the prep. But then there's that consideration to a longer prep, potentially a harder prep. You never 100% know how your body will respond in a prep. So there is those thought processes, and if you find that you're in this cycle of overeating, binging, however that looks, when we look at it being purely a physique-based sport, we then have that sort of comeuppance, as it were, when we get to the prep and the relationship with food is not in a great spot. We've had the potential to be overeating, binging, body composition maybe not as favorable as we'd like it, then it makes that prep, a different type of prep. And it's thinking ahead to that. But at the time, it's very hard to do that. And this is why being able to gain help and support to understand your relationship with food. And if you want to work on that, there can be a multifaceted approach to how we work on this for you as an individual. And that's super important. And I understand I've been on a few, tangents there, but it's super important for me to always cover these types of topics because it is, like I say, in this space, we're regarded as the people that are just mentally so strong, and at times we're not, guys, trust me, we are not. And I could easily go, and that is okay. And it is okay. But for you, if you are on this pedestal of being this person, it's not always going to be easy. So just starting to think about the things you want to work on and who you can trust. And it might not be your coach initially. Maybe it's a friend in the bodybuilding space. Maybe it's your partner. Maybe that's the first step to acknowledgement. Maybe it's journaling and speaking with yourself essentially and working on ways where you can take ownership and then how you can move forward past that initial acceptance of where you're at. I hope, guys, that you've enjoyed listening to this episode. As always, if you think that this episode will help someone I would be very grateful and honored for you to share the link with them. Anyone that would like to share it on their stories, it helps me up the awareness of the podcast and get in more ears, hopefully, because that's super important to me. And guys, I really do want to thank you for allowing me to be in your ears and be part of your journey because it really does mean the absolute world.